Britain, 1941. A thin winter sun rises over a Royal Air Force airfield. The grass is white with frost. The hangars breathe out steam. Somewhere above the clouds, a Spitfire begins to dive. The Merlin engine roars, then coughs, and suddenly dies. For a few terrible seconds, there is nothing but wind and silence. The pilot pulls back. The propeller catches again. Too late. The enemy has already vanished into the clouds. That silence becomes the sound of frustration, and the sound of physics misunderstood. For the world, the Spitfire is perfection. A blade of light in the gray British sky, but deep inside its famous heart lives a quiet flaw. Under -G, the carburetor loses its balance. Fuel rushes upward, air disappears, and the engine starves. Every pilot learns the same reflex. Never push the stick forward. Never dive straight after a German fighter. Always roll over first. Lose seconds. Lose distance. Lose the fight. In the mess halls, the phrase repeats like a curse. We can't follow them down. We have to let them go. Across the channel, the enemy dives freely. They have fuel injection. The British have tradition and a carburetor. Inside the Rolls-Royce factory at Derby, engines wait in long rows. Steel tables, the smell of oil, the echo of hammers. Among the workers moves a woman with calm, precise eyes. Her name is Beatrice Shilling. She is 32, an Oxford-trained engineer, sharp, solitary, and fast as the motorcycles she once built with her own hands. Before the war, she raced them. A woman in leather, beating men around the track. Now she tests carburetors for altitude performance and fuel flow. Her tools are rulers, gauges, and patience. When she reads the RAF report, Merlin engine cuts out under -G, she doesn't complain. She begins to draw. On a piece of paper covered in numbers, she traces the fuel line like a vein. Her pencil stops above one chamber. The float. That is where control is lost. Outside, bombers head for Europe. Inside, under a single lamp, she performs the quietest act of war. She thinks. Engineers in wartime live under pressure. Perfection costs time, and time costs lives. Yet she can't ignore a flaw that kills not by bullets, but by gravity. In her notebook, she writes one line. The Merlin dies when the pilot acts like a pilot. Night settles over Farnborough. The blackout blinds the windows. Her lab smells of warm oil and burnt rubber. The radio mutters names: Tobruk, Crete, Tripoli. Somewhere out there, men are falling from the sky because physics betrayed them. Beatrice sketches again. She murmurs equations under her breath. The carburetor, she knows, is a balance of air pressure and fuel pressure. Under +G, the float behaves. Under -G, it rebels. What she needs is not power, but restraint. A smaller path. A way to tame the flood. Past midnight, she closes her book and steps into the cold. Her motorcycle waits under a street lamp. The machine is freedom and rebellion and thought. She kicks the starter. The engine barks alive. She rides through empty lanes, headlights sweeping over fences and snow. Each vibration carries a new idea. Fuel, air, fire, balance. Combustion feels almost human. By dawn, she returns to the lab, cheeks raw from wind, mind steady. She draws a circle the size of a coin. Next to it, she writes one word: washer. A restrictor plate. Brass, maybe? A tiny hole to slow the surge of fuel when the plane goes weightless, but still wide enough to feed the engine when gravity returns. Nothing grand, just geometry. She calculates the numbers: pressure differential, viscosity, altitude density. Each figure fits like a tooth in a gear. The simplicity almost makes her smile. The solution isn't invention, it's control. Around her, the war keeps grinding. London burns. Factories race to meet quotas. Supervisors warn her not to over-engineer. But the sound of engines failing haunts her. Her brother flies with the RAF. Every time a Merlin passes overhead, she listens for the cough that means a pilot is falling. She writes a short proposal. Interim restrictor device for float-type carburetor to prevent flooding under negative acceleration. 2 pages, 2 diagrams. Nothing more. Her supervisor scans it, half distracted. "Miss Shilling," he says, "pilots are trained not to dive. It's hardly critical." She answers softly. "Until they need to." He sighs and scribbles his initials. It's not approval. It's permission to fail quietly. She takes it anyway. That evening she cuts a thin disc of brass. Her hands are steady. She drills a hole no wider than the lead of a pencil, 0.07 inches. She files the edges smooth and fits it between the float chamber and the jet assembly. She primes the fuel line. The engine coughs once, then idles. She tilts the frame to simulate a dive. The idle holds. The vibration stays steady. She breathes out, barely a whisper. "All right then, let's see if you can keep up." Outside, the searchlights fade. Engines start. The airfield hums back to life. Somewhere above, Spitfires climb through the morning haze. She imagines them diving, engines roaring, power steady, fear replaced by control. It's only a test bench, only a theory, but every revolution of that engine feels like a promise. When she shuts it down, the silence is heavier than before. The weight of a war still waiting for one more idea. She holds the washer up to the light, a small ring of brass, warm against her palm. Nothing special. Yet in that simple circle lies a change large enough to tilt the balance of the sky. History rarely begins with noise. More often it begins like this, with quiet calibration, with patience, with precision. The pilots don't know her name. The officers don't believe they need her fix. The factories keep counting engines by the thousands. But soon, when they push the stick forward into a dive, the Merlin will keep breathing. It will roar instead of choking. And no one will know why. For now, it is a secret between one woman, a piece of brass, and the laws of physics that refused to obey tradition. She sets the washer on the table, turns off the lamp, and walks out into the night. The snow has stopped. The world holds its breath. Somewhere above the clouds, a Spitfire dives again. This time the engine stays alive. Beatrice returned to Farnborough before sunrise. The air was heavy with fog and coal smoke. Engines coughed awake in distant hangars. Her small office smelled of brass filings and cold tea. The washer she had tested the night before lay on the table, still warm from the engine. It looked almost fragile. And yet, inside that tiny ring, she felt a kind of power. By noon, she carried it to the testing hangar. 2 young mechanics followed her, curious but skeptical. They had heard rumors. A woman engineer, a homemade fix, something about fuel control. They didn't expect much. She spoke softly, but clearly. "This is not a redesign. It's an adjustment. If it works, you'll feel it before you believe it." They installed the modified carburetor on a test Merlin. The sound filled the hangar, low and deep. She nodded to one of them to tilt the engine frame. Negative G simulation. The pitch dropped, then steadied. No stall. The boy's eyes widened. "It's still running," he said. Beatrice only smiled. "Yes," she whispered. "That's the point." But small victories do not win wars. The device needed approval, and approval lived in London. She packed her drawings, her test log, and the prototype washer into a brown envelope. The next morning she boarded a train toward the Ministry of Aircraft Production. The carriage was cold. Her gloves smelled faintly of fuel. Outside the window, fields blurred by, white, quiet, exhausted by winter. At the ministry, the clerks barely looked up. She waited 2 hours outside the meeting room, listening to typewriters and muffled conversations. When her turn came, 3 men in uniform studied her over stacks of paper. One of them spoke with a thin smile. "Miss Shilling, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but carburetion is not a strategic issue." She looked at him calmly. "Tell that to the pilots who can't dive." They exchanged glances. Another man leaned back, hands folded. "Fuel injection is coming. Rolls-Royce is working on it." "I know," she said, "but not fast enough. This is a field modification. It needs no factory change, no retooling. It can be installed by mechanics in under an hour." Silence. One officer cleared his throat. "Your calculations are solid, but this is unofficial." She met his gaze. "Unofficial doesn't stall." For a moment, no one moved. Then the youngest of them, a pilot liaison, spoke quietly. "What's it called, Miss Shilling?" She hesitated. "It doesn't need a name. It just needs to work." He smiled faintly. "Everything needs a name. Otherwise, no one remembers who made it." When she left the building, snow was falling again. The letter of authorization never came. But a copy of her drawings found its way to the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford. Within a week, an order arrived. Miss Shilling to report with prototype for evaluation. She rode there on her motorcycle. The trip took most of a day through sleet and mud. When she arrived, the pilots were already waiting, curious, half amused. Someone joked, "So you're the woman who wants to teach a Spitfire how to dive?" She grinned. "No, I just wanted to keep breathing." The test Spitfire stood ready on the tarmac, its nose silver with frost. She watched as they fitted her tiny brass washer into the carburetor. It looked absurdly small against the machine's power. One of the pilots, a broad-shouldered man with oil on his hands, winked. "If this thing saves me a dive, I'll buy you a drink." The propeller spun. The engine came alive, smooth and steady. She stood beside the runway, coat flapping in the wind, as the Spitfire rolled forward and lifted into the pale sky. It climbed fast, then arced over, nose down. Her breath caught. For a second, she expected the cough, the stall, the sound of failure. But the engine kept roaring. The plane dove straight down, leveling out above the airfield like a hawk. A cheer rose from the ground crew. Beatrice exhaled slowly, smiling without realizing it. The brass ring had held. When the pilot landed, he climbed out still laughing. "You've just made every dive safer, and every German nervous." She only nodded. He handed her a small patch of fabric torn from his flight glove. "Keep that," he said. "First dive that didn't scare me." Word spread quickly. They called it Miss Shilling's Orifice. Crude, perhaps, but affectionate. Pilots trusted it. Mechanics installed it by the hundreds. Soon, every Spitfire and Hurricane carried her small invention. But for Beatrice, the approval brought no relief. The skies were still full of fire. Every victory was temporary. And yet, for the first time, she felt the war answer back, not with applause, but with silence. Engines that no longer choked, planes that no longer fell. In the weeks that followed, she traveled from base to base, inspecting installations. She wore a leather jacket over her uniform and carried a small toolkit everywhere she went. Pilots greeted her with admiration and jokes. One called her the woman who fixed gravity, another, our lucky charm. She only shook her head. "No luck," she said, "just math." At one airfield, she met a pilot who had lost his brother over France. He asked if she believed the washer had really made a difference. She paused before answering. "I don't believe," she said. "I measure." At night, in the quiet quarters given to her, she wrote new reports by hand. The lamp hissed softly. Outside, the wind rattled the window. Each note she wrote was both precise and personal. She never mentioned pride. She never mentioned fear. Only flow rates, pressure limits, and efficiency curves. But in the margins, sometimes, a few words appeared. Test successful. Pilot safe. One morning, while leaving an airfield, she stopped by a hangar. A Spitfire mechanic was cleaning a carburetor. He looked up, surprised to see her. He held the washer between his fingers, smiling. "Hard to believe this little thing keeps us alive." She looked at it for a moment, then said quietly, "Hard to believe it took so long to listen." Spring came slowly. The war showed no mercy, but the balance had shifted. British pilots began to dive faster, fight longer, climb higher. Their engines no longer betrayed them. Beatrice returned to Farnborough only briefly. Her desk was buried in requests for more modifications, more tests, more reports. But one letter stood out. It was from a squadron leader she had never met. In careful handwriting it read, "Your device saved 2 of my men last week. You may not hear it often, but thank you. The sky feels different now." She read the letter twice, folded it, and placed it in her notebook. No medals came, no speeches. But that wasn't the point. She hadn't built it for glory. She built it so that men could come home. That night she stood outside the hangar, watching the lights flicker across the runway. Engines rose into the sky, steady and confident. She listened until they faded into the distance. Then she whispered to the empty air, "Stay alive. All of you." The next morning she rode again, north this time, to another base, another test, another set of engines. The motorcycle's sound merged with the low rumble of the planes overhead. 2 rhythms, 1 heartbeat. For the first time since the war began, she felt in tune with the noise of survival. And that was the day the sky finally answered back. Spring in England was slow that year. The rain came sideways. The fields near Farnborough drowned in mist. Engines warmed the air with their steady, comforting hum. War was still everywhere, but so was routine. Machines, reports, checklists, the rhythm of survival. Beatrice rode from base to base, inspecting the modified carburetors. Her small leather notebook filled with numbers, signatures, and quiet proof that the Orifice worked. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't dramatic, but it saved lives. And in a war built on chaos, saving 1 life at a time felt like defiance. She began to recognize faces, mechanics who waved when she arrived, pilots who shook her hand without ceremony. Sometimes she found the brass washer on a chain around a man's neck, a kind of quiet superstition. She never corrected them. If a symbol helped, it was worth keeping. Every night she sent a report back to Farnborough. Most were factual. Engine performance stable. Negative G-stall eliminated. But between the lines, there was always something else. Fatigue, grief, and a kind of lonely gratitude that no one could admit out loud. One morning, she arrived at a training field in Norfolk. The air smelled of diesel and wet grass. A young pilot was waiting by his plane, his uniform too clean, his eyes too new. He asked her if she was the one who had made that brass thing. She nodded. He grinned. "My instructor says it's witchcraft." "Then it's practical witchcraft," she said. He laughed and saluted her with a wrench. When he took off, the wind flattened the grass. She watched him climb, dive, and recover. The sound of the Merlin smooth and strong. He was just a boy, no older than her students from university, before the war swallowed them all. She realized she didn't even know his name. The next day, his name appeared in a telegram. Training accident. Mechanical failure unrelated to carburation. Gone in an instant. She read it twice, then folded the message into her notebook without a word. Progress and loss, two sides of the same engine. Weeks passed. The Orifice became standard issue. Mechanics called it Miss Shilling's hole. She hated the name, but she never corrected it. Names didn't matter, only results did. Then, one morning, a reporter from the ministry's publicity office appeared. He was young, clean-shaven, full of charm. He wanted to write an article. "Human interest," he said. "A lady engineer who saved the Spitfire." She frowned. "I didn't save anything. I fixed a flow problem." "That's the story," he smiled. "A woman who fixed a problem men couldn't." She sighed. "If that's how you sell it." He followed her around the lab, notebook open, eyes wide. He asked about her education, her racing days, her role in Farnborough. She answered politely, but without warmth. He seemed fascinated not by her work, but by her being there at all. When the article appeared weeks later, it read like a fairy tale. "The woman who taught the Spitfire to breathe." She read it once, then tore it in half. Public attention didn't change her, but it changed the way others looked at her. Colleagues congratulated her with forced smiles. Some called her our celebrity. Others stopped speaking altogether. She had broken an unspoken rule, not about gender, but about modesty. In a war run by men, attention was currency, and she had spent some without asking. That evening she sat alone in the lab, staring at the brass washer under the lamp. It gleamed faintly, catching the light like a coin tossed into water. She wondered how something so small could make her world both larger and lonelier. Her supervisor stopped by, hesitant. "B," he said quietly, "don't let the papers get to you. You did the work, that's what matters." She nodded. But later that night she thought about the word celebrity and how wrong it felt. Recognition was supposed to be satisfying. Instead, it felt like noise interrupting a frequency she had spent years tuning. The next week she returned to Duxford for another inspection. The pilots there treated her with simple respect. They didn't care about headlines. They cared that their engines no longer failed them. That kind of gratitude was wordless. A nod, a grin, a silent wave before takeoff. She preferred that to any article. During one test, she stood near the runway as a flight of hurricanes lifted into the sky. The ground trembled under her boots. She listened to each engine note, waiting for the familiar cough that never came. For a moment, she felt peace. Then, from far above, a burst of gunfire. The planes disappeared into the clouds. She held her breath. Minutes stretched thin. Then one aircraft returned alone, landing hard, wheels screaming. The pilot jumped out, face streaked with oil and sweat. He pulled off his helmet, still trembling. "Two of them didn't make it," he said softly. "They dove after a Messerschmitt. The others couldn't follow." She looked at him. "Did yours hold?" He nodded. "All the way down." She put a hand on his shoulder. "Then it worked," she said. He looked at her strangely. "You talk like this is a science experiment." She met his eyes. "It always is." That night she couldn't sleep. The sound of engines haunted her dreams, not failing, not dying, just roaring endlessly through the dark. She woke before dawn, the same way she always did, and went back to her workbench. The routine was its own kind of mercy. You didn't have to think when you were measuring. In June, a letter arrived from Rolls-Royce headquarters. They were moving toward full fuel injection systems for future aircraft. Her device would soon be obsolete. She stared at the page for a long time. Then she smiled. That was the goal all along, to be replaced by something better. Still, she felt the faint ache of goodbye. The brass washer had become more than an invention. It was a piece of her identity, forged under pressure, polished by war. Letting it go felt like stepping off solid ground. That weekend, she visited a nearby airfield one last time. The men there had painted her name on a wall beside the words, "The Orifice Queen." It was crude and affectionate, like soldiers' humor often was. She laughed despite herself. Better to be remembered by laughter than forgotten by protocol. One pilot offered her his flight jacket as a souvenir. She declined. "Keep it," she said. "You'll need it more than I do." He smiled, then hesitated. "Miss Shilling, do you ever wonder what you'll do when it's over?" She looked past him at the horizon, where the sky was streaked with red. "I'll find something else to fix," she said. That night, back in Farnborough, she sat at her desk long after the lights had dimmed. The war would go on. Engines would change. People would vanish. But somewhere, in every Spitfire still flying, her idea lived, invisible, uncredited, indispensable. A small voice inside every roar. She closed her notebook, placed her pencil neatly on top, and whispered into the quiet, "I'll take silence over applause any day." Outside, the sound of planes filled the night again. Steady, confident, endless. And above the clouds, in that silence she had fought so hard to create, Britain still breathed. The war ended not with fireworks, but with silence. For Beatrice, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like someone had turned off the sound of purpose. The skies that once screamed with engines were suddenly empty. No fighters, no convoys, no orders, only quiet air and the echo of memory. In the summer of '45, she returned to her flat in Farnborough. The walls looked smaller than before. Her workbench, once covered in blueprints and brass, stood bare. She had been promoted, of course. Commendations, letters, a polished plaque from the ministry. But when she looked at it, she saw only an ending. Progress had made her invention obsolete. The new Merlins had fuel injection now. Her washer had done its job too well. At first she tried to keep busy. Lectures, reports, post-war research committees, but every room smelled of dust and conversation instead of oil and flight. She missed the sound of engines more than she expected. The hum had been her heartbeat for 6 years. Without it, time moved differently, slower, heavier. She bought a new motorcycle, something fast, British, loud enough to fill the silence. Every evening she rode beyond the town, through winding country roads where hedges met the horizon. Sometimes she rode until the light disappeared, chasing the last warmth of the day. It wasn't about speed. It was about rhythm, the same pulse she used to hear in the Merlin engines. A controlled explosion repeating thousands of times a minute. Order from chaos. One night she stopped by a small roadside inn. 2 mechanics sat outside, talking over pints. They recognized her name. "You're the carburetor woman," one said, half laughing. She smiled. "Once upon a time." They offered to buy her a drink. She joined them, listening as they argued about post-war engines, jet propulsion, the future of flight. The words were new, metallic, full of optimism. She listened, but didn't join in. Her mind still belonged to pistons and spark plugs, not turbines and kerosene. The next morning she wrote in her notebook, "Technology moves forward. People forget the hands that pushed it." Then she crossed it out. It sounded bitter, and she refused bitterness. Back at Farnborough, she was assigned to jet research. The lab was bright, sterile, full of young engineers barely old enough to remember the Blitz. They treated her with polite respect, but their questions carried curiosity more than reverence. To them, the war was history already, and she, a relic of it. Still, she worked. Old habits died slower than wars. She studied airflow at high altitudes, designed cooling systems for early jets. Her precision was legendary. If a measurement was off by a hair, she could see it before the instruments did. The younger men called her Aunt Bea, half in affection, half in awe. She accepted it with a small smile, even if it made her feel older than she was. But at night, when the lab emptied, she sometimes stood by the window and listened for sounds that weren't there. No bombers, no sirens, only the hum of the generator. Peace had its own kind of loneliness. One afternoon, she received a letter from an old pilot. The handwriting was rough, uneven. He thanked her for the hole that kept his plane alive in '43. Said he had a family now. 2 sons. He ended with the words, "I still remember that sound, the dive that didn't end in silence." She folded the letter and held it for a long time. Then she smiled quietly. That was enough reward for a lifetime. Years passed. England rebuilt itself. The world moved faster. Jets, rockets, nuclear power. She adapted, but she no longer chased glory. Her pride was in the small details, the quiet victories no one noticed. If an engine didn't overheat, if a system didn't fail, she was content. Still, there were moments when the old fire returned. During a test flight at Farnborough, a prototype jet malfunctioned on landing. The team froze. She didn't. She walked straight to the wreck, helmet under her arm, eyes already calculating angles and temperatures. The pilot stepped out, shaken. She said only, "Let's find out why it happened." That calm steadiness, that refusal to panic, reminded everyone why she was still there. But the excitement faded quickly. Peacetime engineering was careful, bureaucratic, full of safety meetings and paperwork. The urgency was gone. The war had been brutal, but it had given her clarity. Now everything was theory and budget. Sometimes, when no one was looking, she took her motorcycle down to the old testing airstrip. She'd park at the edge of the tarmac and just listen. Wind through the grass. The faint crackle of static on an abandoned radio. It wasn't much, but in her mind, she could still hear the Spitfires diving overhead, engines steady, alive. Her invention might have been forgotten, but the sound never was. In the early '50s, she was invited to a dinner at the Air Ministry. It was an event full of speeches and uniforms. Old men toasted victories, young ones quoted numbers. When someone introduced her as the woman who kept the Merlin alive, she laughed. "I didn't keep it alive," she said. "I just kept it from dying too soon." The room went quiet for a moment. Then came applause. Polite, uncertain, respectful. Afterward, one of the younger officers approached her. "My grandfather flew in '41, he said. "He used to talk about the dives, said it felt like the plane trusted him." Beatrice nodded. "That's all we ever wanted," she said. "Machines that trust their pilots." That night, walking home through the cold air, she thought about trust. Not between man and machine, but between creation and purpose. Her whole life had been a dialogue between those two things. Now the conversation was quieter, but not finished. She lived simply. No children, no fanfare. A few close friends from the research world, a small house filled with books and tools. Her motorcycle still waited by the door, always tuned, always ready. She kept working well into her later years, training, advising, mentoring. She never stopped fixing things. One day, during a lecture to a group of students, someone asked if she ever regretted anything. She paused, thinking. Then said, only that I didn't hear the engines more often." The class laughed, but not unkindly. They didn't understand what she meant. They couldn't. They had never lived by that sound. Time softened everything. Her fame faded into footnotes. New wars brought new machines. But in every restored Spitfire that still flies at air shows, her washer remains. The same small ring of brass, invisible, irreplaceable. A whisper of her precision inside a roar of nostalgia. In her final years, she rode less often. Her hands trembled slightly. But sometimes, when the weather was clear, she'd start the old motorcycle and let it idle outside her workshop. Neighbors would wave. Children would stare at the strange, elegant woman with silver hair and goggles around her neck. To them, she was just a story their parents didn't quite remember. Once, when asked about the war by a young journalist, she said, "Everyone talks about courage. But what we really needed was curiosity. That's what wins wars. The refusal to stop asking why things fail." The journalist wrote it down. She doubted he truly understood, but that didn't matter. The truth had already done its work. That evening, she took the brass washer from her drawer. The original, the first one. It was tarnished now, edges worn smooth from years of handling. She held it up to the fading light, the way she once had at Farnborough. And she smiled. It had never been about recognition. It had always been about the silence that followed, the silence of engines that no longer quit, the silence of lives that continued because she refused to look away from a problem everyone else ignored. That was her peace. Not applause, not legacy, just the steady, living quiet above the clouds. Autumn came with a clean sky. The air over Farnborough felt thin and sharp, like a new blade. Beatrice stood by the old airstrip and watched contrails cross at high altitude. Jets, not pistons. A different music, but still a rhythm she understood. She had grown older without growing softer. Her hair silvered. Her gaze stayed steady. When she spoke to young engineers, she kept her sentences short. They listened. Not because of fame, but because she said exactly what she meant. One morning she met a class in the testing hangar. They wore crisp shirts and ambitious smiles. On the table before them lay a carburetor from a museum Spitfire. She asked a simple question. "What fails first under pressure?" They answered with theory. Float valves, needle seats, thermal expansion. She shook her head. "Assumptions," she said. "That's what fails first. Your job is to find them, name them, and reduce them until the machine has nothing left to betray." They were quiet after that. She could see curiosity replacing confidence. It made her glad. Curiosity was safer than pride. A restorer from an air museum invited her to see a Spitfire being rebuilt. She walked through a hangar washed with winter light. Wing ribs glowed like the bones of a bird. On a workbench, the mechanic had left a small brass ring beside a tray of screws. She picked it up and weighed it in her palm. The man appeared and grinned. "Left it there in case you came," he said. "We don't fly without it." She nodded once, then set it back carefully, as if it were alive. That evening she sat by her window with a cup of tea and a stack of letters. Some were from museums, some from pilots. One from a woman who wanted to become an engineer and asked how to be taken seriously. Beatrice answered by hand. "You do the work," she wrote. "You make your proof visible. You speak less than the men around you until your numbers speak for you. You choose quiet over complaint, precision over pride, and patience over applause. It takes time. Take it anyway." She never thought of herself as a pioneer. She thought of herself as a mechanic of reality. If a problem resisted, she made it smaller. If a system failed, she watched it fail twice, then cut a path through the noise. The war had refined that instinct. Peace gave her the distance to teach it. Now and then, journalists found her. They wanted sentences that sounded like statues. She refused them gently. They wanted heroes. She offered process. They wanted a legend. She gave them a washer. But sometimes she said yes, if only to correct a myth. No, the Spitfire had not been perfect. No, the fix had not been glamorous. Yes, men had resisted the idea at first, and no, that wasn't the point. The point was that good machines honor good minds. If the mind is careful, the machine is loyal. She kept riding the motorcycle. Shorter trips now, slower starts. But each ride still reset the world to a frequency she trusted. Combustion as conversation. Metal as discipline. Speed as clarity instead of escape. On a bright spring day, she visited a village show where an old Spitfire did a flyover. The crowd looked up together, faces tilted into the sun. The aircraft glided past, then banked and dropped into a shallow dive before climbing again. Nothing dramatic, just a clean line, a clean sound, a clean recovery. A woman beside her whispered, "Beautiful." Beatrice nodded. She felt the agreement in her bones. The announcer told the story of the aircraft and the men who flew it. He spoke of bravery, sacrifice, and victory. He did not mention carburetors. He did not need to. Success is often the absence of failure, and absence is easy to miss. A young boy tugged her sleeve. "Did you fly one?" he asked. "No," she said. "I kept them breathing." He frowned, thinking. Then he laughed, as children do when a puzzle clicks. "That's flying too," he said. She smiled. Perhaps that was enough legacy for a day. Back at home, she opened her old notebooks. The paper smelled of dust and graphite. Here were the first sketches. Here, the early doubts. Here, the test logs with small but decisive numbers. She touched the margin where she had once written, "The Merlin dies when the pilot acts like a pilot." She crossed out "dies" and wrote "died." Past tense. History closed by a thin circle of brass. An invitation arrived from a university. They offered an honorary degree. She accepted not for herself, but for the message embedded in the ceremony. Precision matters. So does restraint. So does the courage to spend a life making small, correct choices. On stage, she spoke for 5 minutes, no more. She told the graduates that the world will ask them for speed, for novelty, for spectacle. She told them that the world lies. "What the world needs is fewer promises and better tools," she said. "If you must choose, choose the tool." Afterward, a professor walked her to the car. He asked what she considered her greatest achievement. She looked at the sky. "Silence," she said. He waited. "The kind you hear when an engine doesn't fail. That silence is full of life." In the last years, her circle grew smaller. Friends moved, retired, disappeared. She kept writing letters, advising, checking figures sent by post from small workshops and private restorers. Sometimes a package arrived with a washer inside and a note that said, "For your collection." She added them to a tin on her desk. Each ring a small oath. She thought often about the stubbornness of matter, how steel resists, how fuel surges, how air deceives, and how human minds, when quiet and precise, can persuade matter to behave. That persuasion felt to her like a form of kindness. You ask the world to cooperate. You give it a reason. You wait. One winter morning she woke before dawn and walked, slowly, to the old airfield. Frost crackled under her shoes. The sky was brightening. She placed her hand on the cold railing and listened. For a while there was only wind. Then, far off, a single engine started. Not a Merlin. something newer. But the first seconds were the same as they had always been: a cough, a tremor, a decision to continue. She closed her eyes and let the past and present share a breath. Years earlier, a pilot had written to her, "The sky feels different now." She understood it better with age. The sky is a mirror for discipline. When machines are honest, it feels larger. When they fail, it shrinks to the size of a cockpit. She walked back home through streets that had learned her gait. Neighbors waved. A child pointed at the motorcycle and asked if it was fast. "It was," she said. He laughed and ran ahead. She did not follow. Speed is sweeter in memory. In a final notebook, she wrote a last set of threes. Precision over pride. Physics over prejudice. Patience over applause. Then she added a fourth. Quiet over noise. She underlined it once. The line was straight and unbroken. On her desk sat the original washer, still tarnished, still perfect. She placed it on a folded handkerchief as if returning it to itself. No label, no frame. She preferred tools to trophies. Evening came soft and slow. The last light touched the window, then moved on. Somewhere nearby, a motorcycle passed, a small echo of her own past life. The sound faded into a steady hush. She breathed with it. Not nostalgia. Continuity. Friends would later say she rarely spoke about the war. They were right. She preferred to speak about the work, about the way a line becomes an arc when you measure it correctly, about the way a machine becomes a partner when you treat it as something that can keep its promises. When she was gone, the letters remained. The notebooks remained. So did the engines. Men and women took to the air in restored aircraft that still trusted their own breath. They dove, leveled, climbed, and waved to the crowds below. Most never knew the name that lived inside that trust. They didn't have to. A museum curator once asked how she wished to be remembered. The question reached her too late. But the answer sits quietly in the sky whenever a propeller finds its rhythm and stays there. It lives in the hands of mechanics who install a part with care. It moves in the small decision to measure again, and then once more until the world stops lying. Beatrice Shilling left no statue worth touching and no speech worth memorizing. She left a practice. Ask better questions. Make smaller assumptions. Build tools that let courage do its work. And listen for the sound that means you did it right. It is the sound of nothing happening when something used to go wrong. It is the sound of breath where there was once a choke. It is the sound of an engine that will not die when the pilot acts like a pilot. The shape of that sound is a circle. Plain. Brass. Exact. A ring small enough to disappear in the palm and large enough to carry a generation across the sky.